My husband never touched our joint tax returns, not once in 7 years of marriage. He said it was because he was an accountant and it would be faster if he handled it. He said I'd find it boring. He said he was protecting me from the headache. And I, stupidly, gratefully, let him. I signed where he pointed, initialed where he tapped the page, and handed it back like a child finishing a worksheet. Every April, without fail. 7 years. The first time I thought something was wrong, I brushed it off. We were at dinner with another couple, friends of ours from the neighborhood, and the husband mentioned something about their HSA contributions and how they'd adjusted their W-4 withholding after their second kid. My husband changed the subject so smoothly, so immediately, that I almost didn't notice. But I noticed. The way he redirected, pivoting to a story about a client, laughing a little too easily, I tucked that moment somewhere in the back of my mind and forgot about it for 3 more years. Then came the Tuesday in February when everything stopped being forgettable. I was home with a fever. He was at work. I'd been trying to find our homeowner's insurance policy because there was a water stain spreading across the guest room ceiling and I needed the claim number. I went through the filing cabinet in his office, the one he kept organized down to color-coded tabs, looking for the insurance folder. I found it. But wedged behind it, slipped between the homeowner's file and a thick folder marked Retirement Projections, was an envelope I'd never seen, business-sized, no return address, torn open at the top. I almost put it back. I want to be honest about that. I almost shoved it back behind the insurance folder and walked out to call the plumber. Something stopped me. I don't know if it was instinct or exhaustion or just the particular delirium of a 101-degree fever. I pulled out the document inside. It was a bank statement, but not from any bank I recognized. Coastal Meridian Private Trust, headquartered in Wilmington, Delaware. The account was in a name I'd never seen, the Ashford Family Discretionary Trust. My husband was listed as sole trustee. The statement covered 12 months of transactions. Monthly transfers out, always on the 15th, always the same amount, $1,100, to an account at a credit union in Phoenix, Arizona. I had never been to Phoenix. We had no family in Arizona. Nothing in our life had anything to do with Phoenix. I stood there in his office with the ceiling stain dripping somewhere down the hall and my fever spiking and my hands going cold despite it. I put the statement back exactly where I found it. I took a picture of it with my phone. Then I went and sat on the couch and told myself it was nothing. A client account. A trust he managed professionally that had gotten mixed in with our personal files. An old account from before we met. I told myself all of this very calmly and deliberately, the way you talk yourself down from a ledge, and none of it worked. Because I knew my husband, and my husband did not make filing mistakes. I didn't tell him what I'd found. I don't know exactly why, except that I felt with a clarity that surprised me that telling him would be the wrong move, that if I told him, something would close. Some door that was currently, barely, still open. I kept the photo on my phone and I said nothing and I waited. Over the next 2 weeks, I started paying attention differently. Not suspiciously, at least not visibly. Just attentively. I noticed that his phone was always face down on the kitchen counter, that he'd recently changed the password on his laptop, which he hadn't bothered to do for years, that there was a second Gmail account I glimpsed once when he was typing his email address into a store's rewards program, the same name as his usual one, but with a number at the end I didn't recognize. He typed it by mistake and switched quickly to his normal one, and when I said, "Oh, you have a second account?" he said, "Yeah, that's just my junk mail." And he smiled and went back to signing up for the rewards program. I smiled back. I started keeping notes in a journal I stored in my own car. Dates. Times. Small things that I couldn't explain and that he hadn't offered to explain. 3 weeks after I found the bank statement, I called my college roommate. She's an attorney now, not family law. She does commercial litigation, but she knows people. I told her I needed to speak to someone quietly. Someone who handles financial issues in marriages. She didn't ask me why. She just said, I know exactly who to call. Let me make a few calls. The woman she connected me with was named Harriet. She ran a firm that specialized in what she called marital financial forensics. She wore reading glasses on a beaded chain and spoke like someone who had heard every version of every story and was not surprised by any of them. I sat in her office in a beige chair and spread my phone photos on her desk. She looked at them for a long time without saying anything. That trust structure, she finally said, is not something you'd use for a client account. It's personal. Discretionary trusts like this are set up to give the trustee complete control over distributions. No one can compel him to pay out. No one can see it unless they know where to look. The beneficiary designation is a name I can't quite make out here. She squinted at the photo. She said, "Can you get me clearer images of the full statement? The beneficiary section especially." I told her I would try. I want to explain what it's like to live in your house and feel it become a place you're investigating. Everything stays the same on the surface. We still had dinner together. He still asked me about my day. He still drove me to my chiropractor appointment on Saturday mornings because I'd had a bad neck since my car accident 2 years ago, and he knew I hated driving after those sessions. He was still, in every visible way, my husband, and I was still, in every visible way, his wife, except that I was also something else now. I was watching. The second chance to look at the files came when he flew to Atlanta for a conference. He was gone Thursday to Saturday. The first night, I didn't do anything. I sat with the idea of going back into his office and felt too nervous to move. The second night, I made myself do it. The filing cabinet was locked now. He'd added a small combination lock to the handle. It hadn't been there before. I stood and looked at it and felt the specific sick feeling of a suspicion being confirmed. He knew I'd been in there. Or he suspected. Or he'd always kept it locked and I'd just never noticed. I didn't know which was worse. I went back to my phone and texted Harriet. She responded within 20 minutes with a name, a locksmith in our area she'd apparently worked with before. A man named her contact just referred to as Gerald from Westlake. He was there by 10 the next morning. He looked at the lock for approximately 45 seconds and opened it in under 3 minutes. He took $200 in cash, did not make eye contact, and left. The files were organized exactly as I remembered from the insurance folder incident. I photographed everything in the back section I hadn't seen before. There were 3 additional statements from Coastal Meridian. There was a folder labeled simply with a first initial and a last name I didn't recognize. Inside was a lease agreement, a residential lease for an apartment in Scottsdale, Arizona, not Phoenix. Scottsdale, close enough for a unit I'd never heard of, co-signed by my husband and a woman whose name appeared on the lease as the primary tenant. The lease had started 4 years ago. It was renewed annually. The most recent renewal was 8 months ago. There was also an insurance card, health insurance, listing my husband as the policyholder and 2 dependents. The first dependent was a name I didn't recognize. 7 years old, based on the date of birth. I photographed everything. I put everything back. I drove to a FedEx in the next town over and printed the photos at a self-service machine using cash. I put them in an envelope and I drove to my car and I sat in the parking lot for a long time. The heat was going in the car. It was February and cold, and the sky was flat and white and completely indifferent. He had another child. Somewhere in Arizona, in an apartment he co-signed with a woman whose name I'd never heard, there was a 7-year-old child on his health insurance, and I had been going to bed next to him for 7 years. 7 years of sitting across from him at dinner and asking about his day. 7 years of thinking his careful financial management was love. I drove home. I put a casserole in the oven because he was coming back the next day and we'd agreed I'd make dinner. I set the table. I went to bed. I slept approximately 2 hours. He came home Saturday evening with airport coffee and a keychain for me from the conference. A little enamel thing shaped like a peach, because Atlanta. He set it on the counter and kissed my cheek. I said, "Oh, that's cute, thank you." I put the peach keychain in the kitchen drawer and I served the casserole and we talked about his flight and I said nothing. Monday morning, I went to Harriet's office with the printed photos. She looked at them for a long time. Her expression didn't change, but something around her eyes got very still. She said, "I need you to understand what we're looking at. Depending on when this trust was established and how long the transfers have been going, we may be talking about a significant marital asset that was systematically diverted without your knowledge or consent. In most states, assets acquired during marriage are marital property regardless of whose name they're in. If he has been funding this trust, this apartment, this other person's life, using income earned during your marriage, that is potentially fraudulent transfer." "How much?" I said. She pulled up a calculator. $1,100 a month for 4 years was $52,800 in direct transfers alone. That's before the lease cosign, before the insurance premiums, before whatever cash he's moved that we haven't found yet. She paused. "Is there anything else you've noticed? Any expenses you couldn't account for?" I thought about it. There was a stretch, maybe 2.5 years ago, when he'd mentioned that his firm was investing in a real estate fund and that some of his bonus that year would be tied up. I'd thought nothing of it. I thought nothing of a lot of things. That's what I'm telling you. I trusted him completely, and I thought nothing of a lot of things. Harriet set down her pen. She said, "Here's what I want you to do. I want you to open your own separate checking account today at a bank he doesn't use in your name only. I want you to start moving a portion of your direct deposit there. Nothing dramatic, nothing that will trigger a question. And I want you to get me access to your joint tax returns for the past 7 years. "I don't have access to them," I said. "I've never actually seen them. I just signed." She looked at me over her glasses for a moment. Then she said quietly, "I'm going to need you to request copies from the IRS directly. We can do it together right now. It takes about 10 days. The tax transcripts arrived in the mail on a Thursday. He was home when I got them. I intercepted the envelope from the mailbox first, told him it was something from my dentist's billing department, and drove to Harriet's office that afternoon with the excuse of running errands. The transcripts were dense, full of numbers that meant very little to me in isolation. But Harriet's forensic accountant, a quiet man named whoever she brought in, went through them line by line. He identified 3 things. First, there was a Schedule E on each return rental income reported from a property in Arizona. Not our property. A property my husband owned, had apparently owned for 6 years. He'd been reporting the rental income on our joint returns, which meant technically I'd been filing joint returns that included income from a property I didn't know existed. Second, there was a consistent charitable deduction each year to an entity called the Ashford Family Fund, not a registered 501c3. A donor-advised fund he'd established and controlled. The contributions ranged from $8,000 to $14,000 annually. That money was gone, deducted from our joint taxes, funneled into a fund he alone controlled, directed wherever he wanted. Third, and this was the part that made the room go very quiet, the most recent return, filed 8 months ago, listed 2 dependents. Me and a child. Not our child. We don't have children. A dependent with a social security number I'd never seen, a date of birth consistent with a 7-year-old, and a name that matched the name on the health insurance card. He had claimed his secret child as a dependent on our joint tax return. That I signed, without knowing. Harriet set the papers down. She said this crosses into potential tax fraud territory, filing a joint return with falsified dependent claims without the co-filer's knowledge. That's a federal issue, not just a family court issue. I drove home. I made dinner. I told him I was tired. I went to bed early. He rubbed my shoulder in the dark and said, "You okay?" I said, "Just a headache." He said, "Drink some water." He turned over and went to sleep. I stared at the ceiling for 3 hours. There are things people say about moments like this, that you grieve, that you rage, that you fall apart. I did those things, but not in the order you'd expect, and not in the way you'd picture them. The grief came in waves when I was alone in the car. The rage was cold and quiet and lived in my chest like a stone. The falling apart happened in small, private moments, once in the shower, once in a grocery store parking lot, once sitting on the floor of the closet in the guest room for reasons I still can't fully explain. But inside the house, around him, I was composed. I was a person finishing a task. I called my older sister. She's 12 years older than me, and she has the particular calm of someone who has been through difficult things and come out the other side knowing that difficult things end. She didn't say anything dramatic when I told her. She said, "Okay, do you have somewhere to go when you're ready to go?" I said I thought so. She said, "Make sure." And then she said, "I love you. Tell me what you need." I needed a few more things from the house before I was ready to leave. I needed the hard copies of the mortgage documents, our car titles, and my own passport, which he had inexplicably started keeping in his office desk drawer sometime in the past year. I told him I'd seen it in there once, and he'd said, "Oh, I grabbed it for something and forgot to put it back. I'll move it." He never moved it. I didn't push. I'm making a list, in my mind, of all the things I didn't push on. The list is long. I also needed to hear it, not from documents, from him. Harriet told me not to confront him before everything was in place. She was very clear about this. She said, "He is a financial professional. If you tip him off before we have the accounts frozen, he will move things. He will restructure. He will create distance between himself and the paper trail. You will spend the next 3 years chasing ghosts." I understood this. I agreed to wait. What I did not agree to and did not tell Harriet was what I did on the Saturday morning when he thought I was at my book club. I drove to Scottsdale. It's a 4-hour drive. I told my sister where I was going. She made me promise to call her when I arrived and when I left. I promised. The apartment complex was nicer than I expected. Desert landscaping, a pool, the kind of place that has a leasing office with a fruit-infused water dispenser. The unit number was on the lease. I drove around to the right building and I parked and I sat in my car for 20 minutes. Then I got out and walked to the door and knocked. The woman who answered was around my age, maybe a year or two older. She had dark hair and she was wearing a Northeastern University sweatshirt and she was holding a mug of coffee. She looked at me with no particular expression. Just the mild, slightly guarded look of someone opening the door to a stranger on a Saturday morning. I said, "I think our husbands might be the same person." It took her a moment. Then something moved behind her eyes. She stepped back and opened the door wider. We sat at her kitchen table for 2.5 hours. Her name doesn't matter for this story. That's her name to share or not share. But what matters is that she was not what I had spent the last 2 weeks imagining. She was not a person who had knowingly participated in something cruel. She was a person who had also been managed, handled, given a carefully constructed version of events that made everything seem reasonable. He had told her that we were separated, that our marriage was over on paper, but that the divorce was held up in complicated asset negotiations because I was, in her version, making it difficult. That he was providing for her and their daughter because he was a good man trying to do right by his kid despite a messy situation, that as soon as things settled, he'd be there fully. Their daughter was 7. Her name was Bay. She was at a friend's house. There was a drawing on the refrigerator, a house. 2 people, a son, a dog they apparently didn't have, but Bea apparently wanted. I looked at that drawing for a long time. She said, "How long have you been married?" 7 years, I said. She closed her eyes. Her daughter, she told me, was conceived 8 years ago, which meant he had been with her before we were married, which meant he had made a choice at the beginning of our marriage to enter it already knowing there was a child, already sending money, already maintaining 2 lives. He hadn't fallen into this. He had walked into our marriage with it already in place. I drove home. That night, I told him I needed to talk to him. He was at the kitchen island looking at his laptop, and he looked up with that easy, familiar expression he has, slightly curious, completely relaxed. The expression of a man who has been managing situations successfully for years and sees no reason that should change. I said his name. I said, Scottsdale. I watched his face. The relaxation didn't disappear all at once. It drained, slowly from the outside in, like water leaving a bathtub. What replaced it wasn't exactly the expression I'd expected. It wasn't guilt. It was calculation. He looked at me the way he looks at a spreadsheet when something doesn't balance, trying to figure out where the error was, where I had gotten in. I said, I know about the Ashford Trust. I know about the apartment. I know about the health insurance dependent. I know about the tax returns. He said, Margot. I said, that's not my name. He closed his laptop. He said very quietly, how long have you known? I said, long enough to not be doing this unprepared. He tried 3 versions of the conversation after that. The first version was the remorseful one, where he was sorry, it was complicated. He'd been trying to protect everyone and he'd made mistakes, and he loved me. He did love me. That part was real. The second version was the defensive one, where technically nothing he'd done was illegal. The trust was structured correctly. He'd been paying taxes on everything appropriately. This was being blown out of proportion. The third version was the threatening one, which came out around midnight when he realized I wasn't going to be moved by either of the first 2. He said that if I pursued this, it would hurt people who didn't deserve to be hurt. He said that Bea was a child and that whatever I did would affect her. He said that if I went to the IRS, I was also implicated because I'd signed those returns. That last one was supposed to land hardest. I could tell by the way he said it. And it did land. I won't pretend it didn't. My hands were shaking in my lap where he couldn't see them. I said, I signed returns prepared by my husband, a CPA, who represented their contents to me. That is not the same as knowingly filing fraudulent documents. My attorney agrees with me. Does yours? The silence that followed was very long. He said, You've already talked to an attorney. I said, I've been talking to an attorney for 6 weeks. He said nothing else that night. We slept in the same house, in separate rooms for the first time in our marriage. I heard him up at 2 a.m, then at 4. I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling and felt, underneath the exhaustion and the grief and the residual shaking, something unexpected. I felt like myself. Specifically, clearly, unexpectedly myself. In a way I hadn't felt in years without knowing I'd lost it. My sister came the next morning with her station wagon. While he was in the shower, I moved the things I'd already packed into her car. Clothes, my laptop, my own financial records, the documents I'd copied, my grandmother's jewelry, the things that were mine before he was ever in the picture. It took 4 trips. My sister didn't say anything. She just carried boxes. When he came downstairs, I was standing by the door with my coat on. He stopped at the bottom of the stairs. I said, My attorney will be in touch with yours. He said, You don't have to do this. I said, I know. Then I left. The legal process took 14 months. I won't walk you through all of it because 14 months of litigation is not a story. It's an endurance test, and what matters are the outcomes. The marital estate was significantly larger than I'd known because it turned out the trust and the rental property were not the only things he'd shielded from me. There were 2 other accounts. Harriet's forensic team found them. The total that had been moved or structured outside my knowledge over 7 years came to just under $400,000. The judge who handled the divorce was a woman who had clearly heard every possible version of financial manipulation in a marriage and was no longer moved by performances of remorse. She was moved by spreadsheets. Harriet gave her very good spreadsheets. I was awarded 60% of the marital estate. My attorney had pushed for more, given the deliberate concealment, but we settled to avoid the extended trial. The IRS opened a separate inquiry into the dependent claim and the donor-advised fund. He hired 2 additional attorneys for that. I was formally cleared as a non-knowing co-filer within 3 months of providing my documentation. He resolved that matter privately, which is the polite way of saying he paid a great deal of money to make it go away. He did not go to prison. I spent a long time being angry about that. I still have moments of being angry about it. But I've also come to understand that the outcome he lives with, the professional reputation damage, the bar complaint filed against his CPA license, the fact that his firm quietly parted ways with him 6 months after the story became known in their circles, those things are their own kind of consequence for a man who built his entire identity around competence and control. B got a kidney. That's not right. I'm telling this wrong. B didn't need a kidney. I keep mixing things up because I'm tired. What happened with Bea was simpler and worse and better than that. She grew up knowing her father existed but not fully knowing him. After everything came out, her mother made a choice to tell Bea the truth in age-appropriate pieces, that her father had another family, that it was complicated, that it was not Bea's fault and not her mother's fault, and that they were going to be okay. I know this because her mother and I exchanged a handful of emails over the following year. We were not friends, exactly, but we were 2 people who had been given the same faulty map and had both ended up somewhere we hadn't meant to go, and there was a recognition in that didn't require friendship to be real. The last email she sent me was 8 months after the divorce was finalized. She said that Bea was doing well. She said she'd gotten a job offer at an architecture firm in Denver and she was thinking about taking it. She said, "I hope things are good for you. I hope you got something back that felt like yours." I wrote back, "I think I did." I live in a different city now. My apartment is small and it faces east, and in the mornings the light comes through the bedroom window at a particular angle that makes everything look clean and new, which is not a metaphor I would have chosen before this happened, but here we are. I have a dog, finally, after years of my ex-husband saying he preferred not to have pets. Her name is Frances, after my grandmother, and she takes up far too much of the bed, and I have never once asked her to move. I don't know how to tell you what it's like to realize that the life you were living was a managed life, that your income, your signature, your daily presence had been folded into someone else's architecture without your consent. It's not like finding out you've been lied to about something specific. It's more like finding out the building you've been living in was designed by someone who never intended for you to use the emergency exits. Every room led back to him. Every door he'd quietly, competently locked. I know my exits now. Some days that feels like a loss. Most days it feels like the only thing worth knowing. There's a drawing on a stranger's refrigerator that I still think about. A house, 2 stick figures, a sun, a dog that didn't exist yet. Bea drew it. She was 7 years old, and she drew the life she thought she had, and it was almost exactly the life I thought I had, and neither of us was wrong to believe it. We both been given the same picture and told it was real. I think about that a lot when people ask me how I didn't see it sooner. And I want to be honest. I didn't see it because I wasn't looking, and I wasn't looking because I trusted him, and I trusted him because he had made himself trustworthy in every visible way. He was competent. He was steady. He remembered the things I forgot and handled the things I didn't want to handle and called it love. And that's the thing about someone who controls through helpfulness. They make your own trust feel like a character flaw later. They make you feel foolish for not questioning the very ease they engineered. But here's what I've come to understand. 14 months and one finalized divorce later, the moment I found that bank statement, I had a choice. I could have put it back and walked away. I could have accepted the story he would have told me, a client account, a clerical mix-up, an honest mistake from an otherwise honest man. A version of me, not long before that February afternoon, might have done exactly that. Might have needed to. Because knowing is not the same as being ready to act on what you know. And courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the decision to move despite it. What changed for me was not just what I found. It was that when I found it, I decided I was someone who deserved the truth more than she deserved the comfort of not knowing. That decision, quiet, made alone in a home office with a fever and a photo on my phone, is the one I'm most proud of. Not the confrontation, not the drive to Scottsdale, not the court outcome. That first moment of choosing to look clearly instead of look away. What came after required a different kind of work. It required me to think carefully when every instinct was to react. Harriet told me things I didn't want to hear. Wait, document, don't tip him off. And I had to override my own grief to follow her advice. That discipline, choosing the path most likely to actually protect me over the path that would have felt most satisfying in the moment, is something I had to learn in real time, under pressure, with the stakes as high as they get. And the staying power. That's the part no one tells you about. It's 14 months of legal process after the confrontation. It's sleeping in the guest room while your marriage dismantles itself around you. It's signing documents and attending hearings and answering your phone when you'd rather not exist for a day. It wore me down in ways I am still finding, but I didn't stop. And the woman who didn't stop is the version of myself I want to keep. He made choices that compounded over 7 years into something that could have buried me. It didn't, because of the people who helped me, yes, but also because at some point I stopped being a person. Things happened to and became a person who decided what happened next. That shift is available to anyone. It is not easy and it is not fast, and it does not feel heroic while you're doing it. It mostly feels like getting up again. I know my exits now. That's what I said at the end. I mean it in every possible sense.